Howdy, all you delicious people. I'm here today to review episode 5 of Wandavision. So, really, in all brutal honesty, I think a lot of people, when probably hearing me talk about this episode, is probably going to be hearing me mention things, and a lot of people are going to have the retort back of just like, well, be patient. Like, the answers will come when they'll come. And ultimately, I'm just like, yeah, but I thought we're like, now once we got to episode 4, we were going to start to get to things now. But then ultimately, I already knew that they were going to just be like going right back to our regularly scheduled programming, which is like, to me, like, this one kind of felt like a like back to basics of basically having there be like a stalling method really going on. The only real true information that I had gotten from this episode was something that I had already confirmed numerous times over, that I are like, oh yeah, they're finally telling me what I've already known for I don't know how long now. And like that I've already known this, and I've already known how this story has basically been written out. And I think it's kind of goofy, the stuff that is starting to come out of like some people. uh like, a lot of people are trying to say that ultimately they just want a Jimmy Woo and Darcy like X-Files show ultimately about what is going on within this show. And I'm like, no. That is probably going to be, like, honestly, probably the most boringest thing. And basically, like, you would have them do their own spin-off, and I just don't think that like, if we had like a thing of like Marvel Agents of Shield, that is going to even be worse. But ultimately, I'm sure that they're probably going to have some tying into probably Thor, Love and Thunder, or any number of gosh darn things that ultimately is going to tie any number of these things going on into the MCU at some point. So, reasonably, I felt that we are back into stalling things. Like, if anything, there wasn't really much of this episode that I got out of any of this where I was like, oh, we got to more answers. If anything, the whole, like, everything going on with Vision in this episode kind of gave us answers, or kind of like helped us figure out what had happened to Vision, and ultimately had given us some interesting things going on with Vision in this episode. Again, talking about this in cryptic like sense, like I'm trying best as possible to ultimately kind of help people understand what's going on in this episode without actually having to spoil it. So, reasonably, other than that, I didn't care about any single thing other than that. What is going on, like, what was to go on with Vision in this episode was the only interesting thing, and everything else was, to me, just going like, oh great, I can't wait till next week till we're gonna get to basically nothing and nowhere, and basically we're just gonna keep going on to having this still be a show that is going to basically eventually show you something. What now, 3 other episodes later? Or quite possibly whenever this show ends at some point, then they'll throw you a bone. um I'm still uh I'm still a little bit more intrigued about this show, but when looking at it, I'm just kind of frustrated with this show as well. I'm like, God, this show can't consistently be good. It just has to, like, just consistently be like, okay, we'll give them something, but then we'll just kind of delay. We'll give them this, and then yeah, like, this kind of breaks down into any show that you've kind of ever seen. Like, I'm watching American Gods right now, and I basically feel like this show is identical in the way of of dropping stuff down, meaning like, hey, like we'll basically maybe give you like the first episode and that'll be exciting, and then we'll just give you filler, and then we'll have to like half of the season, the season half season finale will give you something, and then nothing, and then the season finale, oh, that's gonna be a big thing. Like I think kind of Mandalorian was the same way. Like it was just a lot of like missions, and they were kind of interesting missions, and but like it was just a lot of stretching through Mandalorian season 2. Like I didn't care for anything that was really going on in Mandalorian season 2, and reasonably towards the end there, when everybody's like, "Ooh wow," I was just like, "Bah." Kind of figures that eventually they would go that route. To a reasonably, it's just kind of like in this WandaVision thing, I'm like, oh, well, yeah, like, of course we're finally going to get something after X amount of episodes. And so this show just feels formulaic to me, of just going like, oh, okay, well, like, people obviously are now going to know when to tune in and when to basically just wait for someone to just review it, sadly enough. Um, like, I think basically after this season, you're probably going to lose a lot of people instead of gain a lot of people. Because everybody was already complaining about the first 3 episodes being boring. And so ultimately, I think they've probably lost a lot of people via the show. So that's the sad thing. It's basically just like, well, people are just probably gonna wait to this whenever this season is over and then just binge watch the whole thing. And so reasonably that can just tell you that like where people's subscriptions are gonna lie to or gonna go into is just this being just not exactly a relevant enough show to ultimately subscribe to Disney Plus too. That's ultimately how I feel. It's just this show is not good enough. It's not an MCU quality. It's just a show to fill time. Ultimately, I feel like Mandalorian season 2 was the same way. I loved Mandalorian season 1, and then ultimately I just felt that season 2 was just filler. So let's fill in the gaps by ultimately going, in fact, and talking about this episode and going into spoilers, because at the end of the day, the only there's there's only one true legitimate spoiler out of this whole entire episode. Everything else is just like, nah, this is just kind of just there. So let's get there, and let's ultimately go into that double 5 time thing to ultimately hopefully get into a WandaVision show that I could ultimately say, like, man, like, it was worth going through all of this rigmarole to get to this point. Because I'm assuming that ultimately what is going to happen is the very last episode is probably going to be the most important episode. And so, reasonably, I'm probably going to deem this show like, yeah, this entire show was pointless to watch until the very last episode. And so basically, you could have skipped every single episode till the very end, and then the ending was, ooh, wow, that was cool. That was a great thing. Because ultimately, we have it to where there's still characters that are supposedly going to be on this show at some point. And I'm assuming it's going to have to break down in some capacity, and so on and so forth. So let's go into spoiler time. Spoiler time. It's about that time again as well. This show. Yeah, immediately I'm just like, ultimately for everybody that is still saying like, well, this is nostalgia. This show is about nostalgia. I don't care about nostalgia. We have streaming platforms that can ultimately give me nostalgia at any point and click and second of whatever. If I wanted to see Full House, I can watch Full House. If I wanted to see Roseanne, I could see Roseanne, and so on and so forth. This show is basically like really not giving me anything vastly different than another app could give me, sadly enough. So Going into this show, I honestly thought it was kind of neat, the opening sequence to this episode. I thought it was silly, the little photos of young Vision and Wanda and stuff like that. So we're ultimately getting a episode of WandaVision that is done during a different time period. And so recently this television is to ultimately tell us that, hey guys, it seems that Wanda and Vision are going to have a pet dog. So ultimately, it seems that the kids had ultimately found a dog, and ultimately, we have it to where Wanda is saying, well, I don't think the kids are old enough to be able to take care of this dog. They at least need to be 10 years old. And immediately, we have these seemingly kids that are growing way too fast because ultimately, here's my thought process. When looking at it, it seems that normally shows don't want to deal with really young kids because they're hard to handle. Hence why you normally don't have a lot of babies in shows for very long. Normally, a lot of times they end up growing up to be like seemingly 30 years old by the time the show ends because you end up recasting and recasting and recasting to the point of just going like, yeah, we wanted a much older character so we wouldn't have to deal with child labor laws and all that jazz. So we end up having it to where this show goes into that old fashioned factor of just, well, let's age these kids up as quickly as humanly possible. So reasonably, that's the most important thing that's going on in this show. It's just having older kids with a dog. That's exciting. So we end up having Vision seemingly having to come up with some conclusions. And we have to our Vision is ultimately talking to Wanda, and he's like, you know what? Like, I think I'm starting to, I think I'm starting to understand things. I think I'm starting to figure things out. We ultimately have it to where Wanda is ending up using her magic while Agnes is ultimately in the room, and we have it to where Vision is like, "Hey, we shouldn't use our powers around Agnes," and ultimately Wanda's like, "Yeah, yeah, like no, I think it's fine. If anything, maybe we should showcase our powers to all of our neighbors, and maybe they'll all be fine with it." And so Vision is like no, we shouldn't. And the ultimately, we have it to where Vision is kind of having some issues with all the things that he's learned so far, and we have it to where Wanda ends up sending him off to work, so that way ultimately he would go and kind of work things out and kind of forget about everything because his job will ultimately make him just kind of forget about everything. But instead, we have it to where it seems that Vision had ultimately gone into turning on a computer that seemingly is giving him information about Agents of Sword and all this stuff. And we eventually have it to where uh, Vision ends up touching the head of some of one of these characters, and eventually it seems that he kind of comes to and is ultimately mentioning about, oh my god, I need to call my wife. Oh my god, I need to do this. Oh my god, help me, Vision. And so we end up having Vision ultimately touch this guy on the temple again, and he goes back to being this Leave It to Beaver self. So it seems that everybody is some way or another just we have to our Vision can ultimately free everyone's mind to where they are not under the sway of Wanda. And so it seems that Vision in this episode is starting to really figure things out and put the pieces together. And it seems that ultimately and by the way, especially in this episode, I'm like, man, does Vision like his makeup is just on par. Like I was like, man, like Vision looks really good makeup wise in this episode. Like looking at him, I'm like, I don't know if that's special effects or I don't know if it's just straight up makeup, but man, does he look great. Um, like just looking at his face in this episode, I was like, wow, just like whenever he's in the full on Vision makeup, I'm like, wow, I am so impressed by that. So going on into this, we eventually have it to where we have it to where Wanda is to talk to her kids while Vision is away about how she basically had to have Vision go to work so ultimately he could uh, forget about all the things that he was talking to Wanda about. Because ultimately it seems that Wanda and Vision are starting to really butt heads. So while that is all going on and all that jazz, we ultimately have it to where seemingly um, Rambo and the Agents of Sword are ultimately going and talking about what had happened to Vision's body. How basically Wanda went out of her way to find Vision and collect his dead corpse to ultimately bring him into the the Westview. So, because we ultimately have it to where Vision is coming to Wanda and finally asking um, about Agents of Sword, about the mission that they're on, and he's eventually confronting Wanda about what is beyond the barrier of Westview, like what is all of this stuff, what is really going on, and ultimately we have to where Vision is flying in the air to kind of confront Wanda about all this because he is frustrated and mad at this point. And we end up having it to where Wanda is confirming to Vision and hey, we're married. Hey, everything is fine. And I don't get why you're so upset. And because Vision is not getting answers from Wanda because Wanda is the only one that really and truly knows. We ultimately have it to where eventually Wanda is talking to her sons and bringing up Pedro yet again, her brother. And I'm like, and ultimately they also bring up, they have to re-bring up Wanda's entire origin story again in this episode. I'm like, filler. So, a little frustrating because ultimately we didn't get anything of real true value that explained anything more of what we already know from Wanda's backstory from Age of Ultron. Here's also the thing that ultimately we had a commercial, and in that commercial we had ultimately seen the word Lego or Legos, and immediately I'm thinking, well, the first reference that I know, because it seems like they go to Legos fairly often. One of the references that I know Legos from is from Wolverine Origins, where they ultimately go to Lagos, Nigeria, to find animanium that so that kind of ties Wolverine into going to Legos. It kind of ties into the MCU and so on and so forth from Wolverine Origins to ultimately where Legos is where they could find animanium, and that's maybe a reference to that. But also in Captain America Civil War, they also, I believe, go to Legos to fight off Crossbones, which is ultimately a reference to Captain America Civil War, where ultimately we had Wanda who ends up trying to use her powers and ends up causing more trouble than it was worth to use her abilities. So I'm assuming that is what the reference to Legos really is the Captain America Civil War reference. I'm like, well, here's my thing. Are these commercials just to reference Wanda's past as if we have to figure that all out? Or are any of these things actually going to lead to something actually important? And we're going to have ultimately Wanda maybe going back to Legos, or ultimately this show has some tie into Hydra, or so on and so forth. I'm looking at every single one of these commercials and I'm like, God, I wish there was something that was actually more viable here to tell us that every single thing is going to be reincorporated into this show in the future, but and all this stuff is hinting at all this stuff that ultimately they are going to do some point in the future, but when looking at it, no. Every single one of these references is all to Wanda's past, and basically every single one of these all has to be some little hint to something and whatever. And so recently I was just kind of like, well, like I would have liked the Legos thing to ultimately have tied into uh, the Wolverine movie, because then ultimately that would tie into the fact that ultimately we're going to get more X-Men into here, but reasonably I guess we're never going to get to that. So, but speaking about X-Men, so ultimately we have it to our Vision is confronting Wanda and trying to want to get into answers, and ultimately there is a knock at the door. And so ultimately we end up having Wanda open the door, and sure far enough, we see a silver-haired devil, which ultimately I'm just like, well, I bet a lot of people are going to think that it's ultimately going to be Age of Ultron Quicksilver, but it's not. Because ultimately I'd already IMDb'd who is going to be on this show, and it definitely was not Age of Ultron Quicksilver. It's ultimately going to be the X-Men franchise Quicksilver. You ultimately have it to where Darcy's doing a spit take, and she's like, "Oh my God, who recasted Quicksilver? Pedro." Because ultimately, evidently, Darcy knows every little bit of information uh, about Quicksilver. Evidently, whatever. So, in my eyes, I'm like, well, yeah, like really, when looking at it, I thought in a rational sense that Doctor Strange would probably bring in Quicksilver to have Wanda like back down from all this and make her ultimately just stop doing whatever she's doing. But instead, we just have Wanda, who ends up magically reincarnating her brother as a younger Quicksilver, which makes no effing sense. But I guess we're just gonna have Wanda just kind of like her power is just going to be like ripping from dimensions, I guess. And so whatever she does is whatever she does. So we end up having it to where younger Quicksilver is ending up talking to, because I'm just going to call him younger Quicksilver. I'm not going to call him Pedro or Quicksilver, because when looking at it, I'm like, no. Like, to me, like, I would have rather have liked the guy from Age of Ultron to be on this show. Like, ultimately, I don't care if it's like, well, we want continuity, we want this, we want whatever. I don't care. Like, when looking at it, it should be the Age of Ultron Quicksilver on this show. And ultimately, Disney could have paid this guy any amount of money to be on this show, and ultimately they just went with probably cheaper option, right? It's the thing I'm angry about. Um, if you want to have continuity, why do you need the guy from a X-Men franchise that is absolutely garbage in my eyes? I'm not going to go back to X-Men First Class, X-Men Apocalypse, and all that other garbage. I don't care about the X-Men world with that franchise. And anybody who is tied to that franchise, I am utterly just like, I don't want, like, what are we going to eventually see Jennifer Lawrence back in here, and James McAvoy, and any other people that eventually they probably won't recast? Because I'm assuming that probably Magneto is probably going to be a different Magneto, probably, if they're going to have Magneto in here at all. Um, and everybody's trying to spoil and say it's like, oh, well, Magneto's going to have a cameo, or some other person's going to show up in here. So we have to where Quicksilver ultimately opens the door and ultimately calls Vision a popsicle, because ultimately we have a younger Quicksilver that doesn't know anything about Vision, because this is a Quicksilver that ultimately has never met Vision. This is a younger Quicksilver. Ultimately, when looking at it, we're probably going to see a lot of the X-Men just start dipping their way into this WandaVision. If anything, if they were to pull actually big names from the X-Men franchise and have them on the show, man, would that bring credibility to the show if ultimately they had like Hugh Jackman, or if they had quite possibly any of the other original X-Men characters, not talking about like Patrick Stewart, which I don't think he's going to be doing any more X-Men stuff. I think he's completely 100% like, dude, I'm done. For Logan, after Logan, Patrick was like, dude, I'm done. Um, like, I just think that ultimately they're probably going to have the younger variations of a lot of people, with the exclusion of maybe like they're going to dip into probably like, oh, well, we'll have to have Hugh Jackman because when looking at it, like he's the most valuable out of all of them, and everybody else could just be the younger variations, and so on and so forth. So going on into here, we have it to where Quicksilver is ultimately reminiscing to Wanda about like, hey, Wanda, like it's great to see you again, and ultimately like, hey, it's amazing, and blah blah blah. And so we're gonna have a Quicksilver that probably doesn't know jack squat nothing about probably anything, and we're ultimately gonna have to have Vision ultimately try to ask Quicksilver through an entire episode, like, hey, how did you get here? What do you remember? And so on and so forth. So, but before we get to that, we also have it to where Wanda was alone with her kids, and eventually we have it to where Wanda had heard a drone coming through the Westview bubble, and so we have it to where Wanda goes outside to ultimately have it to where this drone is ultimately blocked by seemingly everyone, and even from her kids. And so we eventually have it to where Wanda ends up magically shooting this drone down to drag herself out of the Westview bubble to threaten the Agents of S.W.O.R.D. people to stop doing what they're doing. And we are also to finally hear from the Agents of S.W.O.R.D. people that ultimately Wanda is putting this whole thing together, that instead of her having some enemy that she is fighting within there, she is the enemy to everyone, and is the enemy to Agents of S.W.O.R.D. So we have it to where Wanda goes out of her bubble to ultimately throw the drone back into the Agents of S.W.O.R.D.'s faces, and we have it to where Rambo is trying to talk Wanda down to ultimately mention that, hey, I'd been there when your kids were delivered, and like you had trusted me to deliver your children, and so on and so forth. And Wanda's like, oh, well, yeah, that's good and well and done and all, but recently I don't want any part of you in my life anymore, so blah, 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 blah. We have it where ultimately Wanda is eventually going to pull the trigger or adjust the triggers on the Agents of S.W.O.R.D. men to ultimately fire upon one of the Agents of S.W.O.R.D. guys instead of on her, and nobody ends up getting killed, luckily, because heaven forbid you lose any number of people that probably don't matter to the story anyways, even Rambo. It seems that even at some point we have to keep continually referencing Captain Marvel in these episodes, and it seems that Rambo doesn't want any mention of Captain Marvel in here, because we have it to where Darcy's ultimately just like, yeah, I love Captain Marvel, she's great, and ultimately Rambo is just like, nah, like whatever, like let's move on, because ultimately we can't tell exactly where Captain Marvel is, because that would ruin some Captain Marvel movie. Or ultimately, I'm sure Rambo is going to have some story in some other movie, but they haven't written that yet, so they can't give Rambo some backstory or whatever, or something going on in the story to tie her to Captain Marvel. Yeah, so really within this, that's all that I really wanted to just say and convey. There's probably a lot of other spoiler, or there's probably a lot of other stuff going on in this episode, but there wasn't a good enough portion of me to be excited about anything. Like if anything, like just understanding what had finally happened to Vision, I guess was the most interesting thing about this episode. I didn't care for Quicksilver. I didn't ultimately care for Wanda coming out of the bubble to ultimately realize that, oh yeah, Wanda had been orchestrating this thing the entire time, because ultimately I had known that the entire time. Like I was thinking, I'm like, yeah, WandaVision, like Wanda's gonna be the villain. Like I immediately thought that this entire time, and ultimately it seemed that also everyone else was thinking that from day one. They were immediately everyone was thinking that Wanda was going to be the villain of this story. Ultimately, I had assumed at first there might have been a villain, but then ultimately I just realized as soon as all everyone was kind of um, really looking in desperation to get out of this Westview bubble, then ultimately I was like, oh no, there is no villain of the story. Wanda is the villain of the story, and she is holding everyone hostage to um, basically put on her Leave It to Beaver uh, story. She is protecting herself. Uh, she's protecting her children from the forces that be, and when looking at it, I think that this is the stupidest thing, because we eventually have it to where Wanda is ending up um, increasing her force field around her Westview bubble to where ultimately no one else can come in. And to where ultimately they're never going to be able to send any more drones in. So I'm assuming Vision is going to have to be the person that is going to have to take Wanda down. Or eventually we're going to have Doctor Strange come in there and take everything down, because ultimately he is even much more powerful than either Wanda or Vision at this point. So I'm assuming we're going to have at some point we are going to have Strange still come in here at the very tail end of everything and undo everything, and then we're probably going to have what would probably be eventually a X-Men uh, versus Avengers movie uh, where Doctor Strange is going to be leading the charge on the Avengers front, and ultimately Wanda is going to be leading the charge on the X Men front. So eventually, I'm assuming or assessing we are going to eventually get a Avengers versus X Men movie, but it's going to be a completely different story than what we are known to have seen in the comic books. Even though, like technically, um, like in the Avengers versus X Men book, we have it to where Wanda is kind of the person that is going to be uh, kind of a person that had been a villain and now is seemingly better. Uh, and in the Avengers versus X Men story, but then the Avengers versus X Men story gets more into the Phoenix or the Dark Phoenix and a Phoenix army, which ultimately ends up being like Cyclops and Colossus and Magic and stuff like that, which ultimately. Magic is ultimately in the New Mutants movie, so when looking at it, they're not going to go that way. And they're not going to have Namor be a Phoenix person either. So eventually, it'll probably just be Wanda and Vision and whoever else is ultimately going to be the new X Men people to maybe be a Phoenix Force of sorts. But, anyways, I think that's all I wanted to say about this episode. Reasonably, I'm just kind of like, get this over already. I'm just kind of frustrated because ultimately it's like I wanted after at least episode 4 to feel like um that we're getting a small little bit of answers that actually matter, and to where we don't have to have something that already feels already confirmed in this episode that we already knew. Like they confirmed that Wanda is the real true villain of this, and I'm like, okay, I already knew that. The ultimate confirmed that Wanda had gone and collected Vision's dead body, and I was like, well, I technically already could have figured that. Um, it's not like she had just like like had him this entire time, because ultimately Vision had died during Infinity War and Wanda had been gone for 5 years. So convenient to have already known that there that was going to happen. Um, that eventually Wanda was eventually going to come back for Vision regardless. To ultimately get his dead corpse to come back alive yet again. And so on and so forth. Quicksilver, I've already talked about that. It's just like people could say, no, like this is going to showcase that eventually there's going to be an X-Men team to happen, and isn't that exciting? And I'm like, no. If you give me Hugh Jackman in here, I will be excited. But until that day comes, I don't care. Because ultimately, uh, knowing full well that Hugh Jackman has basically said that, like, hey, after Logan, he was done. And so, when looking at it, like, if they're going to put an X-Men team together without Wolverine, or with a Wolverine equivalent, because we probably have to do a X-23 movie at some point, or because ultimately that's what they were originally, I think, going to have X-23 probably in the New Mutants movie, but eventually they decided to not go with that. They ended up having her do uh, uh, pushing her to do a solo movie, and then so we had it to where the New Mutants were what they were, and X-23 is eventually still going to eventually, I guess, do a solo film that supposedly could quite possibly have Hugh Jackman in there as like a flashback thing or whatever, which ultimately I'm not exactly like. I'm just like, okay, I liked X-23. Everybody loved X-23, and hopefully they have the same actor who played X-23. So when looking at it, I can just be a person that is just like, wait till this is over. Wait till the last episode. So like it's so worth it to just skip. I just feel it's gonna be so worth it to just skip every one of these episodes now and then just wait for the last episode of this season and then binge watch everything and just be done with it. Um, we'd be better off. But again, I don't know when this show is going to end. If I were to be told and guaranteed that, oh, it's only going to last for 8 episodes, then I would just be like, oh, okay, well, then reasonably, why have 30-minute, 8 minute, or 8 episodes? That seems like a waste. You probably could have had. You probably could have had 16 of these bad boys, and ultimately it could have, like, that would have made sense. Um, I don't know. But anyways, I think I'm gonna get out of here. So I want to feel good about these episodes, but again, I haven't felt good about them since day one. But and ultimately, I'm basically from minute to minute, basically like showing my hand of basically where this show is going to go. So, and I've basically been like, to me, right so far, and so now it's just kind of like, okay, what are they going to surprise me with? What are they going to have me go, ooh, gee golly, this was so great and worth it to watch? Is what I'm really asking at this point. I'm not asking, like, reasonably, I'm not asking for every answer to be solved within the next episode or next week's episode.